Good morning, everybody. Before I forget, I noticed when Randy was talking about that men's gathering, you wouldn't know where to go. So make sure, if you're interested in that, these blue cards have the address, okay? And there's some just outside. I have a few here that we can, I don't know if they came around on this side or not, but you can pass these back. And there's also a women's gathering the 23rd, and the details are in there about that, so don't miss those. I've got to set a few things up, and so think about this question, okay? You can start to ponder. What scares you? How many guys does it take to set up an easel? There we go. Cool. So, anybody have craziness in their lives? A little bit? Yeah, not afraid to say it. I've had some. We had some actually in the last gathering. There were bees, and I've noticed a couple people got stung here already. I wasn't even aware of it. About 5 people afterwards said that they had been stung. And I told them, well, you should have, cried out. And then we thought Holy Spirit had really taken hold. But, yeah, that's not something you come on Sunday expecting. And there's a lot good going on. We've got school starting right now. That's one thing when I thought about what I'm afraid of. I'm not afraid of school anymore. But when I was in school, I had certain things that were fears of mine. But let me hear, what do you all say? What are you scared of? Go ahead and just speak out. The unknown. Yeah. Change. Failure. What's that? What about family? Losing your family. Yeah. Wow. We'll talk a little more about that, actually. Walking in life without Jesus. What else? Your children walking without Him. Yeah. Yeah. When we were sharing earlier, oh man. One person said snakes, another said spiders, and in between the two was bees. And I was like, why? Well, now I understand why they said bees. But there's a lot. And obviously, those that I just mentioned are more superficial kinds of things. Nothing wrong with being afraid of a snake. I get that too. But some of what you said is heavy stuff, right? And that's what we want to talk about today. I think it's a little bit of a window into the life of Moses. We'll spend time dealing with Moses, who he is, how Jesus relates to Moses, which if you're the early church, that's a huge deal. So hopefully we can unpack some of that. But I think this question about what scares you, keep going over that some in your mind, because it's the impact point for what we're looking at today is right there with that question. And I can't answer it for you. The thing that came to my mind as I was processing it is what you shared about failure. And school did that for me. It just set up this mindset that to fail would be awful, I don't know why. I don't know. Not everybody is that way, but for me, school did that where I was actually afraid to be wrong, afraid to fail at something. So, speaking of fear, what's going on this week? What's been big in the world? Brazil, trying to zero in, Olympics. And Ben doesn't like the Olympics. So he's just going to, cover his ears right now. But I know a few of you, anybody watching a little bit here and there? See, yeah, you're outnumbered. But there was something I heard last weekend. And they said, they talked about a fear that one of the swimmers had. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I went looking it up. And it wasn't that they were afraid of you see the water turning green? Anybody see pictures of that? That was the diving pool, so that wasn't the swimmers. And it wasn't, this whole Zika stuff or anything like that. This fear had been early in his life. It's a guy named Cody Miller. You probably haven't heard his name, but he was born with a structural condition where he has a sunken chest. And he started swimming when he was 8, just to strengthen that, kind of expand, work on the heart and the lungs, because if you can imagine, when you have that condition, your heart and lungs aren't as strong as you want them to be. So he started swimming for that reason. But I don't know if you see a problem with that. I've been an 8-year-old boy, and I can just picture that feeling, going to the pool, being on the swim team, and having this very obvious condition. So he had to overcome that. But he was very good. And he set age group records. He went to, anybody know where he went to school? You probably don't know anything about this guy. Michigan? No, good guess though. It's a state that borders Michigan. Yeah, Indiana. He went to Indiana University and did very well there. And then he made the Olympic team. He's 24 now. But he had to work through that. He had to face that. Whatever it is that, are you still thinking about that? What scares you? What really, when you dig in, what really scares you? He had to face that and then decide where to go from there. But he set an American record in the 100 breaststroke. He was part of a team last night. If any of you watched and saw the relay. Okay, well, Michael Phelps is the one that gets the press, but Cody Miller was one of the legs in that relay. And so clearly, he's overcome. And it's not just about the medal in that case. And it's really not for us, because how many elite athletes do we have besides me? I'm the only one. Oh, okay. But, come on, life's not about sports. The stuff that you all brought up is more important, I would argue, even though the Olympics, big deal. Yeah, we get it, but we're also kind of I have to agree with Ben, we're kind of overboard on the sports, even the sports that have shoe contracts. We pay a little bit too much attention to. So Moses, I said that we were going to talk about Moses, and he dealt with fear in a very real way too. I don't know if you know his story, but he was born into a slave class, right? And then, just through circumstances, he ends up at the opposite end of the spectrum. But he ended up, it was kind of the Bible's first hit and run. He had killed someone, and like you do, when you've messed up, he took off, okay? And so he left and ran in fear. And then he had the fear of obscurity, because he was out just, do I matter? I don't know if you've asked that. Does my life mean anything? Is it going to count for something? And then he had the fear of being asked by God to take something on. And I don't know if some of you might have been tapped that way, where you've been feeling a prompting, like, I'm supposed to do this. I know I am. And it was very clear for Moses. But it was not at all comfortable for Moses, which is one thing I love about him. Because I'm just going to give self-disclosure here. This is like public speaking 101, don't do this. But I'm going to self-disclose. I literally, before I speak, I shake. It's just, it's not like, oh yeah, can't wait. But when God prompts you to do something and you go for it, He's going to allow that to happen. He's going to make that possible. Amen? And that's what He did with Moses. And that's something I love about Moses. Because Moses had either a speech problem or just a flat-out fear. Okay? So I cooked something up, and Darren's going to flip to this. So I figured that you wouldn't believe me that Moses is awesome. And so I proved it on the internet. He's on the list of famous people. And it says right here, black and white, that he is the most prominent Hebrew religious leader of the ancient era. Okay? So, there you go. And then I also drafted a resume for him. This is not something he published out on LinkedIn. But I drafted it for him. And we'll zoom in for you. So, the objective he has is to enter the land, the promised land. I said he was born into a slave family and then joined the palace. He became a prince of Egypt, where he attended university but didn't complete it. Had a little bit of trouble there. And then he went on. He was in the wilderness tending sheep for 40 years. And you can see he's pretty proud of the fact he works well with sheep. He's also a great leader. Led the 1 million-person jailbreak. I don't know if any of you have heard about this, but they said, "Let my people go." And then the people, you've probably seen like a movie or something about this, right? So, let my people go, and then they cross the Red Sea, and then they're wandering out in the desert. And then he also was Israel's first lawgiver and judge. And that's how he is primarily remembered by the Jewish people, is that the law came through Moses. Okay? And he had some trouble with that in various ways, and we'll see it. But that's a big deal. Okay, and then the last thing, this is my favorite, his hobbies. His really into, you like that? Mountain climbing? Yeah. So, and if you want to contact them, you got the info. So, all right. So we're going to go to Hebrews chapter 3, and we tried to do it with the slides before, and poor Darren was working his tail off. So I want to just suggest that you open up a Bible, and Hebrews is almost, you can tell it's almost at the end. You're going to have to flip back a little ways. In this one, it's page 1255 that Hebrews chapter 3 starts on. So I'll give you a little bit of time to find that. And just to set this up, Ben has been talking about the church. Okay? I don't know what comes to your mind when you think about the church, but there's this habit we have. And it's the habit of saying, "I am going to church." Or, "Where is your meeting?" It's at the church. And I do that. But I try to break that habit, because what is the church? We are the church, right? So I'm going to meet with the church would be the right thing to say. Where are you going to meet? We're meeting at the church building, not at the church. So it's a big deal. And this is written to the church, and it's a church that really understood Israel's history. So we'll fill in some of those gaps. Don't worry about that. But we're going to look throughout Hebrews at how Jesus is superior. Jesus is greater. Jesus is the best. And if you want to be the best, you've got to do what? You got to beat the best. Yeah, you got to work at it. By the way, somebody said that there was a birthday this weekend. My sister's 40th is today, and my best friend's birthday is today. So, good day for birthdays. But if you found Hebrews 3, let's start there. And I'll read. "Therefore, holy brothers who share in the heavenly calling, fix your thoughts on Jesus, the apostle and high priest whom we confess. He was faithful to the one who appointed him, just as Moses was faithful in all God's house." And the one who appointed Jesus, that's talking about God the Father. God the Father sent the Son. "Jesus has been found worthy of greater honor than Moses, just as the builder of a house has greater honor than the house itself. For every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. Moses was faithful as a servant in all God's house, testifying to what should be said in the future, or what would be said, in the future. But Christ is faithful as a son over God's house, and we are His house if we hold on to our courage and the hope of which we boast." So there's a lot here. But let's just start with this, okay? Moses, the greatest. And actually, there was a time he had a brother and a sister, Aaron and Miriam. And they were out in the wilderness. I mentioned how they spent a lot of time there. They were out in the wilderness, and Aaron and Miriam are, how to put it, they're jealous, and they're expressing that jealousy, they're grumbling. Anybody who has ever led has had this happen, where people are grumbling. No? You haven't? It'll happen at some point. And they were grumbling. And Moses is, taking the flack. But the Lord, He calls them together. And it's sort of, the picture I have is 3 students being invited into the principal's office. And except the principal's office was this portable tent where they would meet as they traveled throughout the wilderness. And Miriam and Aaron step forward, and God says to them, He says, I speak to prophets through visions and dreams. And they, like you would do if you were in the principal's office, they're like, yeah. And that's what we're saying. God doesn't just speak through Moses. Doesn't He speak through us too? And then God continues. He kind of gives them the stop sign. And He says, but with Moses I speak face to face. Now, I can't even imagine what that is like. But if you read, that's what you'll see, is that Moses, when he went up the mountain, when he did his mountain climbing, that was a joke, by the way, but he encountered God, and God gave him His commands, His law for the society, for the people. And so God says, listen, prophets, yes, I show them the truth in visions and in dreams. Moses, I speak to you face to face. And so that's part of what's going on here, where it says, yours doesn't have quotes in it, but there are quotes around, in verse 5 it says, Moses was faithful as a servant in all God's house. That's what that's about. That is talking directly about when Miriam and Aaron challenged him and were jealous. Now, this whole thing about God's house, the shirts that are out, defend this house and all that stuff, this to me is kind of confusing. But the best way to understand it, it's not talking about God's house like God's building, again, God's house. It's not referring to this. What this is talking about, the best word you might know to use here instead would be like household. So Moses was faithful as a servant in all of God's family. But Jesus is faithful as a son. And then the comparison that it makes, I understand really well. He was here earlier today, but Steve Shirk built my house with the building trades, a team of building trades students. And so I can picture this very, very clearly. A house is good. We all agree, right? Having a place a shelter, we all want that for everyone. And we appreciate that. But it's not like you would say, oh, that's a nice door that you have there on your house. That door is more important than Steve Shirk. Right? That would just be ridiculous. Or that window. Or I gave him a hard time. I compared the toilet, but he didn't like that. And he came up to me afterward, and I was telling him I had a few problems in the house, and I needed him to move in. And he started giving me advice on how to fix them all. I was like, oh no, Steve, I was joking. That's all right. But think about it. Steve Shirk is vastly more important. He could build another house. The house itself is not more important than Steve. And that's what this is saying, is that Moses is part of God's house, part of the family, right? And he was absolutely faithful in what God gave him to do. Now, he messed up, but the truth is that he was the greatest leader, as Wikipedia will tell you or whatever, that there could be. But when you compare him to Jesus as the builder of the house, the one who establishes and builds it, and then notice what it says too. What verse is that? Verse 4, every house is built by someone, but God is the builder of everything. I don't know if you catch what's happening there, but he just said, Jesus built this house, God builds everything. There is a direct connection. Somebody read loudly verses 7, and it goes around to verse 11. Can I get a volunteer for that? Yeah, come on. You can't volunteer somebody else. There you go. Thank you.
So, as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear His voice, do not harden your heart, as you did in the rebellion during the time of testing in the desert, where your fathers tested and tried me, and for 40 years saw what I did. That is why I was angry with that generation, and I said, their hearts are always going astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared on oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest.
Thank you, Linda. Appreciate that. Okay. So like I said, God speaks to prophets in dreams and visions, speaks to Moses face to face. He speaks to me in diagrams, apparently, because at 1 a.m., this is what I saw. So, we'll get to it, but here's what's going on. When you experience fear, when I ask you what scares you, okay? And I don't know if you've arrived at that yet in your own mind. But when you think about what scares you, the danger is heart failure. Scary thing, yes? Speaking of swimmers, there was another swimmer I read about by the name of Dana Vollmer. And her, you might have heard of her. Anybody heard of Dana Vollmer? Okay, a couple of people. She's been more successful. She's only had 23 medals in world championships and the Olympics, 19 gold, so slightly successful. Women just don't get the press, I'll tell you what. They found a condition that she had inherited that caused her heart to misfire. It's like it's like a wiring problem, okay? And it's called long QT syndrome, which sounds horribly scary. Whenever they start throwing the initials out there for you, so long QT syndrome. And she was given a choice. She was a young swimmer at the time, like in her teens, older than Cody, but still very young. And she had a choice whether to get a defibrillator implanted and stop swimming, or to keep a defibrillator at the poolside at all times. I mean, they're not joking. And this condition can cause instant heart attack, instant death. And elite, I guess I shouldn't say elite athletes, competitive athletes are 3 times more likely to experience that, 1 minute you're here and 1 you're not, through this condition. So that's a serious choice to have to make. And that kind of heart failure gets your attention. And that's what we're being told right here. Did you catch this? Today, if you hear His voice, do not harden your hearts as you did in the rebellion during the time of testing in the desert. Now, what is going on there? I don't know. This is kind of like family background. So you may know some, you may know not. You may know not. Yoda speak. You may not know what the history is on this. So I'm going to fill you in. I'm going to give you like the Reader's Digest version of it. Okay? So, Darren, let's go to the map. And the people of God are enslaved. They're a slave class. An entire huge people group that's working for Egypt. Okay? It'd be like if the United States went to Canada and said, you work for us now. Okay? That's kind of what you have going on. And they were living where the circle is. Oh, I forgot I turned this off. They're working where the circle is here. And they have that 1 million-person jailbreak. Cross the Red Sea, over into this wilderness area, the Sinai wilderness. They're very disorganized. Of course, you've just been in slavery for all these centuries, and there's not any societal structure. So Moses is trying to figure that out. He gets advice from his father-in-law, Jethro. Yeah, really? Seriously? Not from the hillbillies, but different Jethro. not Jethro Tull, but his father-in-law was named Jethro. So Jethro tells them, here's how we're going to set this up. And they get some organization, and then they're walking around, and they wander down here to, you've maybe heard of Mount Sinai, and you've thought, oh, what is that? Is that a medical, there is some kind of medical thing called Mount Sinai, but this is the original, all right? This is where Moses went up, and then anybody know about the Ten Commandments? All right, that's probably about all we know. I mean, I'm not knocking on it. It's just kind of a fact that we hear the Ten Commandments. We don't realize that there were 12 chapters of the law being given to Moses. So, the people were impatient. They're getting restless. They start to have rebellious thoughts that creep in. And they decide that they want a shiny God. So they put together this they melt some stuff down and they make this golden young cow. Not like that part. But a little baby cow, gold. And it sounds ridiculous. Does it not? Nobody thinks that sounds ridiculous. That they would say, okay, we need a God that we can see. So they are going to make a golden calf. What's the deal? Well, actually, it's common. That was how people worshiped their gods, as they would handcraft them. And I would just point out, before you scoff at that whole thing, that we tend to attach significance to some objects too. Ours might be more in the style of chrome instead of gold or what have you. But we have that tendency. So they received the law, and then they set out. And already you've seen that there were problems. This golden calf was a bump in the road for sure. But they're in the wilderness, and the people are grumbling. And then you have Miriam and Aaron. That's where that happens, where they challenge Moses more behind his back than anything. And then in the next chapter, so this is happening in Numbers chapters 12, 13, 14, if you ever want to kind of go and check me on it. But they're out there in this wilderness down here, and the land that God has promised is just up here. So it's over the ridge. Now that's a longer distance than what it seems like on the screen. But they send 12 spies to go check it out. All right, they send out Jason Bourne and James Bond and 10 other guys out into the land. Seriously, there's Joshua and Caleb. I don't know which is which between Bond and Bourne, but they send the 12 out, and those 12 come back, and they agree 100% about the important facts. Number one, this land is amazing. This land is plentiful. It has everything we need. It is a good land that God has provided for us. And the second thing they agreed on was that this is a daunting task. This is a scary people who live there. And there's reason to fear. It's not like there wasn't something to fear. And when I ask you what scares you, I'm sure that it's real. It's not like you're making something up. Okay? And that's what happens here. And so Joshua and Caleb, they look at the situation, and this is where the disagreement takes place. James and Jason, the two spies. Caleb and Joshua are really their names. They say, let's go. God's promise is good. We should trust Him. The other 10, the only difference in their report is they say, I'm not so sure. I really think we might be putting ourselves too far out on a limb on this. And that's not a quote. But they basically just undermine the people's courage. And so what's the reaction? What do the people do? What do you think? What's going to happen here? Are they going to listen to the two who say, yeah, the whole William Wallace, let's go conquer? Or are they going to listen to the 10? You can imagine, because of what we just read, they're going to listen to the 10. And it's pandemonium. It's a melee. The mob mentality is so fascinating because they are going to execute Joshua and Caleb just for saying, let's do what God has called us to do. And they're going to execute them. So God steps in. And he is fed up. He says to Moses, why do this people despise me? Why do they despise me? And it's heart failure. He sees what's happening. And Moses, this is why he's the greatest leader. Any leader will look at this situation and God says, let's kind of go back to square one. I'm going to clear the slate and let's go back to square one. Moses says, no, no, no. He pleads for mercy. And God shows mercy. But there are consequences. So look at verse 11. I declared on oath in my anger, this is the Lord speaking, they shall never enter my rest. So here's what you have. You have fear that leads to heart failure, and I want to talk about that a little bit, which results in rebellion. And then what's the outcome of the rebellion? What's the consequence that they experience? They do not get to enter God's rest. And in their case, that's talking about this land. It's going to be the place of rest where they will settle and they'll be a nation. Pretty heavy stuff. That generation was disqualified. And I just want to say this because I feel compelled to give this warning. We too can be disqualified from what God has for us if we experience heart failure and rebel. I want to dig into this a little bit. When the Bible talks about the heart, when we talk about the heart, we draw these nice pretty things. Decorate our papers, dot. Anybody dot their I's with hearts? I used to teach in high school and a lot of people would dot their I's with hearts. It's like, oh, that's so cute. Nope, still wrong. But it's not that kind of heart when you're talking about the Bible. The heart is not just an emotional driver. It is your will. Okay? It's your decision making. It's your center of decision making. And that's more what it's talking about here. It's to have God's heart. I don't know if you've heard it said about David, that he was a man who had God's heart, a man after God's own heart. And what that's talking about, it's not like David was this emotional dude. He didn't care. He'd dance in front of everybody and all this stuff. But that's not what it was about. What that's saying is, you want what I want. Do you want what I want? And if your heart lines up with God's, then you're just trying to find and you're trying to want what He wants. Okay? Does that make sense? And even when David failed, what did he do? He cried out. He acknowledged. And that's having God's heart. That's saying, Lord, you have got to restore me, because this is not me picking myself back up. And so that's what's going on when we talk about the heart. And then rebellion, this sounds very dramatic, okay? That you have heart failure and then you go into rebellious mode. This is what takes place in the wilderness. But this rebellion really boils down to the choice to turn away from God. That's all that is. Turning away from God. And Hope and I didn't coordinate. These songs, I felt as though we could have sung the songs and then sung them again, and that would have been the message, because she was so spot on with that God has this plan, but I am not sure. And I don't know if I will have the courage to follow. And that's what happened with them. They didn't. So let's go to verse 12. Hopefully you still got that open. Because here's the answer. Here's the alternative. See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. I feel like I gotta hit that one more time. Sinful, unbelieving heart. What is a sinful, unbelieving heart? It sounds so big, so lofty. But really, it just means that we fail to trust. Failure to trust. That's a faith failure. When you think about faith, I don't know what comes to your mind. For a long time, I thought faith was this checklist. Do you believe this? Yep. Do you believe this? Yep. Do you believe this? Inside, I'm kind of thinking I'm not sure, but I'll just say yes because I know I should. And then you go down the list. All right? And if you hit check, 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 then you have faith. I want to challenge that idea of faith. Because yes, facts matter. What you believe matters. But I think the issue, what it boils down to right here, is not whether you've got the right checklist. It's whether you're going to trust. And where's that show up? Where does it show up? Whether you trust or you don't. Huh? In your faith? Yeah, absolutely. But how do you know? How does anybody see that? Your actions. What you do. I mean, that's what it came down to. The people, they didn't go. They didn't go. It's pretty simple. See to it that you don't have a sinful... We think about sin. Here's another thing I want to challenge about that we can think over. You can kind of, take it or leave it. But sin. So often we think of the moral failure. Like the lying, cheating, stealing country song sort of thing. That's what we think about sin. Moral failure. But couldn't it just as much be faith failure, a failure to trust? Isn't that what happened? What happened in the wilderness? Was it that they, were swearing? You said a bad word. You sinned. No, it's that they failed to trust. So that's what's happening here. And here's the alternative. Encourage one another daily, as long as it's called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness. Encourage one another daily, as long as it's called today, so none of you will be hardened. So if you want to stop this, right here, and not allow fear to go to heart failure, you have to, what's the alternative? Because honestly, all this is kind of depressing, and I'm sorry. And I should put no rest. No rest. So, the alternative to heart failure is going to be faith. And again, I want to challenge you to think of that as trust. Are you going to take the step? Are you going to do what trust requires? And faith, here's the awesome thing that can happen if we encourage one another. Joshua inherited Moses' job. And I'm not going to go into all of it, but Moses didn't get to go into the land. He had some issues too. But Joshua is standing there, and this guy who was the spy, the James Bond of the Israelites, he is afraid. And the Lord says to him, Joshua, be strong and courageous. 3 times he tells him, be strong and courageous. And through trusting, you can find the strength and the courage. And where's that going to lead? To his rest. But look at this. Encourage one another. This is to you. You can't read this alone. You can't read this alone. You know why? Because it says encourage who? One another. How are you going to one another by yourself? If you figure that out, let me know. But it can't be done. So we need each other. Encourage one another daily. This is a call to action for the church. If you're going to be God's house, this is how you get there. This is what you do. It's ongoing. Like God said to Joshua, be strong and courageous. That's what we need from each other. And it only comes from dealing with things at an honest level. Okay? I'm just going to tell you that. We can't just have our thing together and smile and pretend. You know? That's not going to give me courage. Tina sharing like she did today, that gives me courage. And we need to each be doing that for one another. Because here's what's going to happen. And I'm just going to add this. Through that, you can experience God's rest, which is a subject in and of itself. But let's boil it down. You have a big opportunity, let's say. You might have a big challenge, a big problem. What scares you? Have you answered that yet? What scares you? Whatever that is, it can either lead to heart failure, which leads to turning away from God, which leads to no rest. But at any time, God is gracious. And at any time, He will transform that failure of your heart, of your will, of your want to, into something beautiful. And I'm going to tell you this story that hit me right in the center. There was a man who came to Jesus. And he said, Lord, my son is sick. He's terminally ill. Please heal him, if possible. And the Lord said, if you believe, all things are possible.